Welcome back, nerds. Before we jump into today's review, I just want to remind you guys, if you haven't already, consider hitting that subscribe button, as it really helps the channel out, as well as hitting that like button if you agree with my opinions on Final Fantasy XVI, or the dislike button if you disagree with my opinions. And finally, hit up those comments and let me know, what is your honest opinion of Final Fantasy XVI? What side of the fence do you fall on, or are you kind of in the middle? Do you think it's a really good game, but it's not an RPG? I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments below. So while I can't say I'm a longtime fan of the Final Fantasy series, I can say that I have played every single game in the franchise, and I guess I have a very interesting viewpoint on Final Fantasy XVI. Because all of these games are extremely fresh in my mind. I mean, I played pretty much most of these games at least once within the last year. That's how recent I've played every single Final Fantasy game. And I have to say, when I saw the trailers for this, I was actually pretty excited for it, because this game looked like it was going to be a step in a completely different direction. And I know Final Fantasy fans probably do not like to hear me say that, but it seemed like it was going to be a step in the direction of what really interests me. And that is the whole Game of Thrones aspect, because that's what it seems like that this game was going to take inspiration from. And it actually did. Final Fantasy XVI took a lot of inspiration from Game of Thrones, and you can really see it to the point where you can compare a ton of different similarities to the characters and to the events to Game of Thrones events and characters. And I think that's what makes the story more interesting to me, in my opinion. And let's start by talking about the story. So I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. I think the story for this game is one of the best in the series, in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, there's a couple that can easily compete with this one compared to the other stories from Final Fantasy games, but I think this one's definitely easily top 5, maybe even top 3 for me. That's how much I really like the story in this one. And it's a good thing that I do like the story, because I think something that might be a drawback for a lot of people and for other people might really enjoy it, but there's a lot of scenes in this game. I mean, a lot of cutscenes, especially when you first dive into the game. And if you played the demo, you probably already know this, but there is a load of scenes just in the demo. Like, it feels like 80% of the demo is scenes, and the other 20% is combat. One of my favorite video game franchises of all time are the Kingdom Hearts games, and that's mainly just because of the story it tells. And don't get me wrong, it's a really complicated story, but I really love how creative they get with the story there. And I feel like Final Fantasy XVI kind of takes a lot of elements from Kingdom Hearts and kind of brings them over here by making it a little bit more gritty though. And that's not just with the story, that's also with the combat, which we'll talk a little bit more later. But as I mentioned, this is not a spoiler video, so we're not going to talk too much about the spoiler elements. However, I will say that this game is loaded with twists and huge moments that will completely catch you off guard. But honestly, there's a lot of really cool moments that completely shock you, that completely blindside you. And I don't think I've been this stressed out playing a Final Fantasy game throughout the entire series, because I never know who's actually going to die, who's going to live, what's gonna happen next, because some really interesting, crazy things happen throughout the story that completely catch me off guard. And while we're talking about those cutscenes, I think the visuals are top notch, which they should be, because this was built for the PlayStation 5. But they do a really good job, because the visuals are gorgeous and beautiful. And I know I've said this multiple times throughout the year, but this is probably one of the best looking games of the year, especially when you dive down into those icon battles. The icon battles are fantastic. They're pretty much kaiju level boss fights in the game, and each one stands out and is completely different from each other. Stay tuned, because I'll probably do a ranking on the different icon battles, but basically the icon battles are pretty much where you take the form of a giant beast and you fight other giant beasts, most of which are 10 times, even 1,000 times bigger than you, honestly. But they are so cinematic and so exciting to participate in, and it really stands out, because I really can't think of other huge boss fights like this that really have me as excited as this game had me. Some of the other things I really liked is the fact that the side quests are really fleshed out in this game. One of my biggest complaints when it comes to side quests in any game really is whenever they're pretty much tedious and they don't really add too much additional story to the overall arc of the entire game. However, this time around, the side quests really give you some deep backstory elements to a lot of characters that you don't really get to learn unless you complete these side quests. Without diving into spoilers, there's a lot of characters specifically that are part of the hideaway that are in the fight alongside you that you don't really get to learn about why they are there and how they join unless you do these side quests. And by doing these side quests, you learn more about their backstory and about why they joined Sid in this hideaway to fight against the treatment of bears. So now let's talk about the combat, because that's probably the most divisive part of the game. Some people absolutely love the combat, other people really don't, and it's mainly the people that are really attached to the old school Final Fantasy games that don't like the new combat. I think one of the biggest complaints with the combat in Final Fantasy is that it really doesn't feel like an RPG, and that's because there's not too much of an upgrade system for your characters this time around. There's not really a lot of different spells you can learn and stuff. It's really just learning 4 abilities for each icon for the most part, and then upgrading those to be even stronger. And while you can shift those out with other icon abilities, there's not a huge upgrade system. I think the best way to decide if this game is going to be for you in terms of the combat is what type of gameplay do you like in your RPG? Because for me, I really like this, and actually I think it's a step in the right direction, and I really enjoyed the combat. However, I'm a huge fan of the Kingdom Hearts games, as I've said multiple times, and there is a lot of similarities to the Kingdom Hearts gameplay in this one compared to like previous Final Fantasy games. And there should be, because some of the game developers on Kingdom Hearts actually worked alongside the developers for this game to help work on the combat for Final Fantasy XVI. So you can definitely see the similarities, and if you like the combat and the fluent gameplay of Kingdom Hearts, you would probably like Final Fantasy XVI gameplay. While it's not as complex as the Kingdom Hearts combat system, in my opinion, it's still very similar, and you can see the reminiscences of Kingdom Hearts gameplay in Final Fantasy XVI. However, if you're more of someone who likes the old school RPG elements of Final Fantasy, and you like the strategic turn-based style of Final Fantasy, you're probably not going to like this at all, unless you're really interested in checking out the story. Because honestly, the story is really good. The story is fantastic, and I really think most people should give this a shot, specifically just for the story. I think when it comes to the story, there's 2 really key elements that really define Final Fantasy XVI story. One is the fact that it takes a lot of inspiration from Game of Thrones. I mentioned that earlier, but there is a lot of inspiration from Game of Thrones, where you have competing nations battling for property and conquest and their own personal beliefs. And that's what Final Fantasy XVI focuses a lot on. You see people betraying each other. You see people doing maneuvers and secret, shady tactics to get at the top of the Game of Thrones. And that's exactly what you see here. Specifically, you see it with some of the characters. Again, it's really hard to talk about this without hitting up the spoilers, but the easiest way I can just explain is that there's gonna be betrayal, there's gonna be backstabbing, and there's gonna be murder, and so many things that relate to Game of Thrones. So if you really like the Game of Thrones feel, where you have battling nations, you have the whole politics side of things, while also having the war side of things, and then the background things of people trying to maneuver in the background to get their own personal goals accomplished, then I think you're really going to like Final Fantasy XVI's story. A second key element that I think is a very overarching element of Final Fantasy XVI's story, and that is the fact that magic always comes with a cost. Kind of reminds me of Full Metal Alchemist, actually. Because Full Metal Alchemist, if you haven't seen that anime, it pretty much focuses on the whole aspect of magic comes with the cost. If you're gonna do something, you have to have an equal reaction to that magic ability. So for example, if you're gonna bring someone to life, then you have to sacrifice someone to bring someone to life. Does that make sense? And you always have to give to get something, and that's what Final Fantasy XVI focuses on a lot with magic, which it's really unique exploration of Final Fantasy's story, because magic is something that has been around throughout every single Final Fantasy game, and it's a very important part of every single Final Fantasy game. And Final Fantasy XVI finds a way to kind of make it unique of how it tells a story with magic, but also shows the consequences of magic. And you really get to see that explored in a really unique way that I think was very fulfilling and I really enjoyed. But now let's talk about the cons, because there are some things that do not make this game perfect, because this game is by far not perfect. And specifically, we're going to first take a look at Ultima, who is kind of the main villain of the story. Now again, to avoid spoilers, I'm pretty much just going to talk about some basics about this character, but for the most part, he is kind of bland. He's not a very exciting character. Mainly, I think it has to do with the fact that they wanted him portrayed as kind of an android-like personality, where he doesn't have a personality. He kind of talks like how an AI of a machine would talk. so you don't really get much emotion there, and you get a little bit closer to the end, but really you don't see much emotion and character development with this character. Actually, there's a different character, Barnabas, who I think would have been a better main villain, a main focus point of this game, because I think Barnabas is much more exciting as a villain, and his backstory and his roots actually has me more intrigued, and I like his character development as a villain. Another big complaint when it comes to this game is that this game really doesn't feel like a true RPG. Now, someone like me, again, this kind of relates to the Kingdom Hearts gameplay, and Kingdom Hearts isn't really a true RPG either. I mean, it is, but it doesn't feel like it compared to a lot of RPGs out there. And I feel like Final Fantasy XVI is very similar to that, but I'm okay with it. However, I can see the complaints, and I can see why people are upset with the gameplay and the combat system for Final Fantasy XVI. So it doesn't really surprise me that a lot of people aren't fans of the fact that it doesn't feel as much as an RPG as a lot of RPGs out there, really. Also, something that really bothered me with the combat was the camera movement. There was a lot of movements with the camera, and it was going all over the place, and I get it, it's really hard to kind of follow a fast movement combat system, but you've seen it done much better in other games. Perfect example is Kingdom Hearts, but another really good example that this actually is very similar to in terms of the combat is Devil May Cry 4. I feel like Devil May Cry 4 actually did a better job with the movement of the camera when you're in combat than Final Fantasy XVI did. I found myself in a lot of situations in the combat where I just lose track of myself, and it's kind of like the camera is like forced me into like a mountain, and I can't really get a good look. And of course, it takes a while to like maneuver yourself. Or there's some abilities like that twister attack, which I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but that twister attack that you do with Garuda's icon, and that really kind of messes you up, because if that move happens and you're like around that twister, you can't really see your character at all. But other than that, I didn't have really too much problems with the combat system itself. I do think it was a little too easy on the first playthrough, but it definitely is a much better experience if you play Final Fantasy mode. Unfortunately, you have to play through the entire game first, which is the same problem I had with Kingdom Hearts, because Kingdom Hearts had a proud mode that you didn't unlock until after you beat Kingdom Hearts 3. However, the mode that is the most difficult at the time was too easy, and I didn't like that. And I feel like Final Fantasy XVI kind of made the same problem, because there's really not a difficulty level for Final Fantasy XVI until after you beat the game, and then you unlock Final Fantasy mode. You have the story-based difficulty, and then you have action-based difficulty. Now, I do want to go ahead and tell you guys that if you're going to play Final Fantasy XVI, make sure you do not use any of the timely rings attachments, because they completely take out any effort in the combat. They're supposed to make the game easier for people that may not know how to use the combat Final Fantasy XVI, but my problem with that is that it made it way too easy. So make sure you do not attach those rings at all. Otherwise, you're gonna have a very poor gameplay experience with Final Fantasy XVI. Another problem that I had with Final Fantasy XVI is that I feel like there were a lot of unanswered questions. Again, I can't talk about those because of spoilers, but there are a ton of different questions that are left unanswered. Now, it does seem like that they kind of left specific parts of it unanswered for maybe a DLC, and I will have a whole spoiler video to discuss those unanswered questions. I'm going to do a list video of all the unanswered questions for Final Fantasy XVI, but just know that the ending story, while it's a complete story and they did stick to the word about that, there were some missing elements that you didn't really get to explore, like some mysteries that weren't really completely solved, in my opinion. And finally, the last complaint I have about Final Fantasy XVI, while the story is fantastic, it is chef's kiss, and I really enjoy the story, the fact of the matter is that there is a lot of filler moments in the story, even if you just avoid all the side quests, which I don't recommend because there are some really good side quests. But even if you did avoid all the side quests, there are a ton of moments where it's just very useless story elements and cutscenes, and even main quests that don't really feel like main quests, that they feel like they should have been a side quest. And I didn't get the thought process of making some of those part of the main quest. I think they were trying to make the main story longer and expand it, because it does take roughly about 40 hours on average to complete the main story alone, but it did end up adding a lot of fillery elements that I really don't think I needed to have in my main story quest. Definitely makes sense to have some of those things as side quests, but not as part of the main story. But that pretty much does it for the pros and cons of Final Fantasy XVI. Now I guess the question is what do I think of this game? What kind of number would I put on this game? Well, again, I'm taking a look at this from my perspective, from someone who's more of a fan of the Kingdom Hearts games, that kind of style for an RPG, versus the old turn-based RPG. And then when I take into consideration the visuals, the cutscenes, the icon battles, which I think are top-notch and probably some of the best parts and best boss fights of the game. And one of the things I try to consider whenever I put a number in for my review is how much replayability to it. How much do I actually see myself wanting to come back to this game and replay this game and play this more and more and more. And because of the story and because of the combat and the gameplay and even the new game plus, which makes things even more difficult, more exciting, and changes a little bit things here and there, I see a lot of replayability here, and I can see myself playing this game even now. Even a week from now, I can see myself replaying this game. So ultimately, with everything considered, I have to give this game a 10 out of 10. I know there's a lot of fans that are probably not gonna be happy with me because, like I said, the fan base is completely divided down the middle with this game. You have people that really hate this game and hate the direction that Final Fantasy went for this title, and then you have people who really love this game and they think it's the best game in the franchise. And I really truly do think that this game has Game of the Year potential. Yes, it's not the perfect RPG. I wouldn't even consider it on the level of other RPGs like Elden Ring and stuff like that. But I do 100% love this game, and I had a lot of fun playing it, and it's 100% in the running for Game of the Year for me, in my opinion. But that's gonna do it for this episode of Nerd Space, guys. Hopefully you really enjoyed my review. Again, hit up those comments, let me know what do you think of this game, and subscribe for more Final Fantasy XVI stuff because I am doing more content on Final Fantasy XVI. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Final Fantasy XVI, and I have a lot of lists planned for this, including what I'm doing later this week on the 7 unanswered questions after beating Final Fantasy XVI. But as always, guys, I'll see you on the next Nerd Space. Take care.